Thank you for joining the session today. We are thrilled to have you all amongst us for this webinar. We have Mark Wentovski with us today, who is an API documentation specialist and a senior technical writer with over 11 years of experience in writing web-based documentation that helps API developers to explain their solutions to various audiences. He'll be speaking on the topic, documenting GraphQL APIs versus REST. Thank you, Mark, for accepting our invite and coming here to share your insights on the topic. In this session, he'll speak about GraphQL versus REST API and how each type exposes data and their fundamental differences in terms of their architecture and how their query mechanisms affect what needs to be documented. After the presentation, Shakir Hussain, Manager Product Management POI, moderate the QA session. We encourage all the participants to key in your questions on the QA platform here so that our team can collate and hand them over to us. Thank you. All right, Mark, over to you now.
Okay, all right, great, thank you. All right, yep, so today going to be talking about documenting GraphQL and in particular, how is it sort of different from REST? So not going to be covering a whole lot about REST, focusing mostly on GraphQL. I think a number of you probably are familiar with REST so far, so I think this is a pretty good topic. So why learn GraphQL? Well, there's a few reasons. It's growing in popularity. Companies like GitHub, Spotify, Twitter, Shopify, Pinterest, they're all kind of creating GraphQL APIs, or they already have them. And Stack Overflow and JetBrains sites like that are showing metrics that show an increasing interest in it among developers and business people as well. For yourself, if you're a technical writer, so it can help facilitate communication, as it's sort of this schema-based approach where it's sort of the single source of truth, and your documentation itself can be a single source of truth, and that sort of acts as like a contract between front-end and back-end developers, your documentation and the schema. Next, as a tech writer, is the ability to write interactive examples, which is something that GraphQL's tools kind of allow you to do. And then you can allow the readers of your documentation to test queries and sort of explore the API directly, something that's maybe a little bit more challenging with REST. The last is enhancing developer experience. So GraphQL really has a focus on developer experience as part of the design itself. And by creating quality documentation, that'll definitely like even more improve the developer experience. So it's a good opportunity there. And just in general, it's a skill that's probably going to set you out, because not a lot of people have experience with GraphQL as tech writers so far. So yeah, it's definitely a good area to kind of look into. And kind of comparing the two. So starting off, so well, I guess what are the similarities? So they're both approaches to designing APIs, different approaches, and the main way they differ is they have different way that they structure data, and then how you request data, clients request data from the API is different. They're also something important, they're not mutually exclusive. So as I was kind of mentioning before, most companies won't have just a GraphQL API. They'll have a REST API, usually that came first, and then they'll have a GraphQL API that's either a layer on top of REST, or it's both APIs are available through an API gateway, for example. So they complement each other well. There's different use cases for both. Some client apps are more suited towards REST sort of endpoint structure. Other ones, prefer the flexibility of GraphQL. We'll kind of get more into that in a minute, though. So REST, just as a quick summary, is just it's architectural style for building APIs. It's aimed at networked applications, which are basically applications that communicate over the internet. And when you interact with the REST API, you're passing these sort of CRUD operations, which are these sort of create, update, delete sort of things that you're doing to the data that you're sort of like you want back, you're requesting, or you want to change in the system. So it's basically endpoint based, which you can think of almost like an endpoint. It's like a URL that allows you to access these different resources, basically, which are basically data objects. So one thing that stands out is that it's strictly defined data structures You have to request things in a certain way, the way things are ordered and formatted, and things like parameters have to be a certain way. You have to order the request bodies a certain way. There's not much flexibility with it. Kind of going on to that. So yeah, endpoint based. So what we're kind of looking at here is Swagger UI, which many of you have seen. So Swagger UI is basically referred to as Swagger. It's just a tool used to interact with REST APIs using sort of a web interface. And this is sort of the Swagger pet store, which is kind of iconic REST API. You kind of quickly see based on this, the structure of REST, it's just basically a whole lot of endpoints. Sometimes going to be hundreds or even like, I've seen like 1,000 endpoints of just different URLs basically that are the endpoints. And then each of those endpoints might be the same endpoint, but it's a different CRUD operation. So like, post, delete, those are all different operations. So it's a huge list of URLs basically. It's like when you look at the document. So so that's the first point is REST is endpoint based. The next is it's fixed and structured. So right here, I kind of opened up one of those endpoints, and it'll kind of replay in a second. But I'm basically creating, adding the data here. So ID, I want to retrieve a pet with that certain ID. And then in that data that I'm providing, it has to be very structured. I can't put that ID below the category or below the name. It has to all be there. And then the API dictates what information is returned. In this case, it looks exactly the same as what's requested, but you don't have access to sort of change that. So, okay, so GraphQL, let's contrast that with GraphQL. So GraphQL is a little bit different for us. It's a query language for requesting data. So as a query language, it's kind of obvious. It allows you to build queries, why it's called a query language. And in those queries, you're able to specify the structure of the data that you want. You're not limited to sort of like a predefined structure of the data. Second thing is it's a schema-based approach for client-server interaction. So client-server interaction, how it works is just clients requesting data from the API server. And it's based off the schema. We'll kind of get more into what the schema is. Basically, schema is basically sort of like the equivalent of the OpenAPI spec, sort of, but it's sort of it's a bit different. We'll get into that in a second, though. So if there's one word to kind of describe GraphQL, would be flexible. So what we're kind of looking at here is the GraphiQL tool, which is the main tool for sort of exploring GraphQL APIs. If you have a GraphQL schema, then you're able to sort of use GraphiQL to sort of represent that. It's sort of similar to Swagger in that it will produce, it allows you to try out the API as well as give you documentation. So pointing out what's different about GraphQL, so it only has one endpoint. So before we saw the whole list of endpoints for the REST API, and that endpoint's actually hidden. You can't even actually see into this interface. And it only uses the post HTTP method, whereas before with REST you had get, post, you had put, and actually like a lot more. So it's actually simplified by just having one endpoint and one method. And basically what you do is you construct queries. That's on the left side. So you can construct queries using the query language. So you have to follow a specific language. How to do it. It's pretty simple to do. And basically you can rearrange any of the fields in that query and tailor the response. Is the important thing, is that the query itself is you're telling it exactly the structure of the data that you want back in the response, which is why it's so flexible. Whereas before, through with REST, you couldn't rearrange any of those properties. You basically had to request it in a certain way and you received back it in a certain way. So that kind of demonstrates the sort of the flexible nature of it. So we're kind of get into one of the main conundrums when you're, particularly with REST, sort of these are the shortcomings that GraphQL is actually meant to address. So the two main things were, why can't I get all the data I need in one request? And that's called underfetching. And then the opposite side of that is why do I have to get back all this data? I only want a subset of it. So that's kind of something that is kind of frustrating about REST, and it can lead to a whole lot of issues. But we'll kind of get into exploring those topics a little bit more. So let's take a like a fake blog API. So this is sort of just a basic API for managing like blog posts. Like a blog is going to have like posts, it's going to have user details, it's going to have each blog post is going to have comments. So yeah, so this is what the spec would look like basically for REST. So for underfetching, so let's say that I'm going to go use this API, like I'm building a blog app, and the API is like the interface to get the data and stuff like that. So example of underfetching would be if I want details for like a specific blog post and its comments. So with REST, looking back at the spec I'd shown to you, so basically I know that I need to send this sort of first request to get passing the ID of the particular post that I want to get the information from. So yeah, that'll give me the post details, but I'm not allowed to get all the comments. I can't request that in the same request. So I'm forced to actually send the separate request to sort of it's like the same endpoint, but except with a / comments on the end of it. So what that will do is return like an array of sort of comment objects. So point is I have to make two requests with that. So if I look at, so say that same REST API was implemented in GraphQL. So I'd be able to fetch basically what I need in one request. So like on the left side, you can see in the request, I can construct a query, and I'm sort of specifying this, what's called a type. So a post would be a type. And then under that, so the post has a set of properties that I'm allowed to request that are sort of part of that post. So I'm basically specifying that I want the ID, title, content, when it was created, and then I can also say that I want the comments for the post, basically ID, text, created app. So it's going to retrieve that blog post and the response. It's going to give me that information about the post I wanted, and it's also going to give me the comments as sort of this array of objects. Like first one's like great post, second one's like thanks for sharing, and so forth like that. The other one is overfetching. So that's the other issue, is that say I want specific user details of a blog author, for example. So I would send a request to the /API/users, pass the user ID, and then I get the user sort of object, but all I wanted was the email and the bio. I don't want any of the other stuff. Well, with REST, the person that designed the API said that nope, when you send this request, you're going to get this entire object back, which can lead to increased network traffic and all sorts of other bad things. So if we look at that, how it would be implemented in GraphQL, I would create a query, and then I would basically pass the ID to the user type. And then I specify within the query that I only want the email and the bio. And then in the response, I get basically the information I need, the email, the bio. I don't get anything else that I didn't want. Okay, so moving on. So documenting GraphQL API. So we'll kind of distinguish the two, I guess, categories. So the first one would be field description. So this would be the equivalent of what you would used to seeing in like the Swagger API. So this would be things for like the schema itself, types, mutations, introspection queries, stuff like that, queries. And basically, what you're looking at here is this is basically GraphQL. This is the same interface I was showing you before for GraphQL, and then there's a docs button or a pane on the very right side, and once it resets, you'll kind of see it in a second. So yeah, right there. So on the right side, you click docs, and then you open up, and so the first page is the entire schema, and you can drill down into queries, and then you can see the different types, and then you can basically analyze it. The different types of arguments you can do. So it's all kind of available right there for you. So how would you actually go about editing it? Oh, and I guess this kind of leads you to the impression that maybe this is something that's edited in like a help authoring tool, but it's actually not. And we'll kind of get into what exactly it is. So like in reality, as you can see under the code comments, this is what what it looks like to actually document a GraphQL schema. So you're actually, the one on the left is the primary one with the code comments where you're adding these sort of like quotes, and then right above the property that you want to describe, you're adding that description in. So that's like one of the main, but that is pretty much how you document fields and so forth in it. But there's other ways to do it. I'm not the biggest fan of code comments or code annotations. I feel like it kind of makes it kind of messy. As you can see, it's just like if you get really out of hand with all those comments. The other ones I want to talk about are different options. So I've seen where you have Google Sheets where you actually manage the descriptions in a Google Sheet, and then there's some sort of script that will basically import those fields into the schema. And maybe I forgot to mention this. So the code comment, that's the actual GraphQL schemas on the left. So the end result would actually look like the first code comments thing, but you would manage the data in Google Sheets. And that's also something that's kind of good because maybe some people might be uncomfortable with like editing, like code or, doing sort of like syntax like that. Most people are, used to using Google Sheets. And it's also really easy to track progress on completion of fields and sort of all the different sort of project management things you get with using Google Sheets. You can do that with your sort of API fields. So I've seen that be kind of successful in my experience. The last thing I wanted to kind of touch on is something that is kind of interesting so you can have like a separate file, like a JSON file or YAML file that would be the location where you define the fields. And I feel like it's a lot easier to manage like that. So you would also, in that case, have a script that sort of imports it back into that first sort of code comments, sort of syntax or whatever. So it's something that would be a bit tricky to do. You'd have to have some kind of validation to make sure that your the structure of your JSON or YAML file adheres to the schema and different things like that. But I've seen it. These are all things that are within the realm of possibility. Okay, moving on to the conceptual docs. So these are things like get started, user guides, use cases, code samples, just any kind of tutorials or what I call pros. Basically, you can use any tool that you're already using. So that would be knowledge bases, help authoring tools, and static site generators. So that pretty much all of that's fair game as far as documenting that. And it just depends on how flexible the tool is as far as sort of keeping your field documentation, what I just shown, up to date with your conceptual docs. Or maybe it's some kind of automation that needs to happen to sort of ensure that those things stay up to date. Sometimes those are sometimes tools are flexible in that way, sometimes they're not. So you have to kind of see what's available. So now I'm going to move on to general tips for documenting GraphQL APIs, and I'm sort of focusing on what makes it different from REST. So I'm not going to cover a lot of the basics of like REST, conduct user experience and stuff like that. Yeah, you need to do all that. You need to do developer experience. You need to do, all this sort of thing, requirements gathering. So moving on. So like single endpoint. So, you need to emphasize sort of that, yeah, it is a single endpoint. It's not like REST with all the multiple endpoints, and provide sort of code examples of sort of like sending queries to GraphQL using libraries. So that's where that URL would come into play. You couldn't see it in the GraphiQL, but when you're configuring an application, you would need to have some guidance around how to send queries to that endpoint. The next is sort of on the query language focused aspect. So basically GraphQL is kind of new, so you need to communicate, actually a little bit about what GraphQL is and sort of its key features, because that definitely will impact, how the documentation is used. Probably don't want to repeat too much information. Maybe reference official documentation for certain things, but then leave things specific to your API and your docs. So basically, compare GraphQL to traditional REST APIs, maybe like the equivalent thing, almost kind of like what I showed you before about, comparing what a request looks like in REST versus GraphQL, and because most people are coming from REST, and it's also kind of a strategy thing as well, as far as like getting adoption for your API, because just having a GraphQL API can be competitive for companies that maybe there's a competitor that has a similar product, but they only offer a REST API. GraphQL, if you offer that, then that can be a competitive advantage. So that's something to highlight in the docs. The next is schema documentation. So, basically you're going to want to provide sort of concise explanations for each type, which would be kind of what I showed you before. So like for the blog API, it'd be posts and user and comment, and document fields like with data types and the purposes for each type. Describe the relationships between the types. So, like relationships like a one-to-many between post and comment. So you can have one post with many comments. So you want to document that. GraphQL supports a lot of times, as I mentioned, that tool, GraphQL is very important. Sort of maybe even do like a tutorial on how to use even GraphQL. Probably, but it wouldn't be just a general. It would be a general tutorial would be, how to interact with our API using GraphQL, something like that. So that in itself could be like a little tutorial. And then access instructions and, testing examples. So that's all stuff that tech writers can help with. Query variables. So, basically describe the concept of query variables. And, basically it's like where you see with the ID there, like passing an ID. And provide examples, demonstrate how to use them, and different queries and so forth. Introspection queries. This is something I think that's really something good for tech writers to get involved with, because it's open-ended. So basically, introspection is a big topic in GraphQL. So it allows you to query sort of the schema itself. So not just do queries where you're querying different, specific things like posts or comments. You can actually posts or something like that. You can actually query the entire API, which is like the entire schema. You can kind of explore that with introspection. So sort of offer examples of queries for developers to explore the schema. So that's like a huge thing you could help out with. That's not something that's like machine generated, and that would be case by case, basis. So explain what introspection is and provide examples in the API, and then it's also good to have make it interactive where possible. Next is security, which sounds kind of boring, but it's actually pretty important. It's definitely like it's actually a really big topic, and it's something that definitely tech writers can help out with. As far as best practices to avoid exposing sensitive information. It turns out there's like tons and tons of opportunities for applications to expose information they didn't mean to, and particularly, with companies never using GraphQL before or GraphQL API, it's really important to provide those security standards for them. Just kind of gives you an example of actually where you can accidentally pass like a password or something. Like you can get a password back, which is definitely, it's not something that would be good to do. You never want to expose that sort of information. So you want to show different strategies for like storing sensitive information, or different ways of creating your application to have this sort of security considerations in them, and make sure that they're covered. Error handling, so that's really important. So it's extremely important, is explain the structure of error messages. So just the entire swath of all the available error messages that are possible in the system, and not only just showing sort of what is this error response, whatever number mean, but documenting common like error scenarios. So these would be like particular use cases that can happen, and then how to handle them. And then there could be the whole like articles on, what to do in those situations. Like support's like a huge topic, and it's ripe for help by tech writers to do that, to help with that. The last is tutorials. So this is another big area. So sort of describe scenarios that users can do. An example of the post. So like user wants to create a new post, basically, and then provide like a step-by-step guide for interacting with the API, and then with an emphasis on practical scenarios. So like an example tutorial could be, you create a blog post, and then you're explaining the purpose of the mutations. Basically, you're creating something in the system. In this case, would be creating a new blog post. It's almost like the equivalent of post in REST. And you're kind of breaking down the different elements of the request, how to construct the mutation query with different placeholders for the variables, and you show them where to enter the variables. Talked about the query variables, as said, and then how to execute the mutation, and read the response, basically. So explain the structure of the response, how to interpret the data that comes back, and then even further than that is what can you do with your application with that? And that's sort of where you get into coding tutorials. This would be more of a tutorial for functionality, which are really important. And then the next step would be coding tutorial, where you show them how would you build this in your application? What are the different things you can do? So that's a whole other area as well you can get into. So that's basically it for GraphQL versus REST. I think there's a number of topics that I did not cover, but I think this is a pretty good overview. So.
Thank you, Mark, for that wonderful session. Now let's move on to Q&A.